Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today I'm here with Jack because we have a mega topic to discuss. It's going to be the best decks in Standard from the Primal Clash into Sun and Moon on formats. So we're going to be looking at the new decks, how they impact the old decks, and all sorts in between. So this is going to be an absolutely humongous video, but hopefully it's going to be one that you all enjoy. So we're going to kickstart with what we had before Sun and Moon.
So yeah, these are kind of the well-defined archetypes at this point. We've had essentially since sort of Worlds, we've actually had a very similar format to this. Evolutions didn't change much. It changed a couple of things, but essentially these are the archetypes that at the moment are considered the best in the format. There's the 8 on the left side are always seen, are always at the top tables, and the left on the right side are more fringe here and there, but have seen success and aren't decks to write off at all. People do well with them. They can deal with a lot of other things in the format. So it's just this is where we are at the moment going into this new format.
Okie dokie. So then we have on the horizon, Sun and Moon is now here as of today, from when we're recording it.
Yeah.
And in our opinion, we have 4 decks that are definitely going to be good, and 4 decks that could be good. So, looking down the list, we have Umbreon ZOROARK EEVEELUTIONS. It's just an archetype that is really based on trying to hit for multiple weaknesses, using the new Umbreon GX as a decent pivot, and has decent output and a cool GX attack. Then we have Decidueye, focused all around its ability and doing extra sniping. LURANTIS VILEPLUME just aims to get the turn 1 lock whilst having a very strong, healthy, high HP Pokemon. And then AQUABOX is the same sort of style of deck that we saw at Worlds, except we replace the Seismitoads for Laprases. That's the idea with all of those. And then we look at what could be good. Solgaleo is a card that has absolutely bags of potential. That Soul Burst GX attack is just way too strong. It's just going to be good in some capacity. We personally haven't found like the best, most amazing list for it yet, but it has so much potential that I think it can't be one to be slept on. Passimian is one that I personally really like just because of how consistent it is. It will always get what it can achieve done. It's just whether or not what it can achieve is good enough. Straight Lurantis is another way of playing Lurantis because it's a GX Pokemon that also has so much potential. The straight build is more simplistic, more based on just being almost like Virizion Genesect, where you have early game acceleration, but also it sort of combines a healing approach with its own attacks and some items that we can play. And then Umbreon Espeon Hammers is the new hammer build that we think could be a decent option. That has a lot of different options as attackers because you can use all 3 of Espeons as well as all 3 of Umbreons in the right situations. So a very flexible deck that can take on a lot of the format just because it can find a way to be awkward against almost any deck.
Yeah, exactly. And what we've noticed with at least these 8 decks is there are a couple of trends going into or what we're getting from Sun and Moon. All of the new archetypes are pretty ability reliant. There's a lot of abilities going into this format. That has been for the past probably 6 months or so. So Garb is still just as good. We will be talking about Garb a little bit later on anyway. But yeah, all of them are incredibly ability reliant. 2 of the top 4 that we've said are definitely good are weak to fire, which is definitely notable. And then another 2 in the could be good are weak to fire. So that's 50% of the new decks that we think have potential over the next few weeks are weak to fire. And considering we have Volcanion already, as we saw on the previous page, such a good in the first half of the decks, which are decks that people are going to play no matter what. That it presents really good things for Volcanion because he has good typing on Solgaleo, Decidueye, and Lurantis, 3 of the best Pokemon in the new set. And there is another Dark deck in the mix. So we've seen Turbo Dark kind of creep into the format towards the end. Towards the end of this format, we've strayed away from YVELTAL a little bit and gone more for a Turbo Dark. Both of those archetypes are still perfectly reliable, and now we have Umbreon in here as well. So it's definitely interesting that we're also seeing another dark deck as well, and something else to think about based on your matchups. The final thing I'm going to say before we sort of go into the main portion of the topic is there's going to be a lot of decks in this video. And now we have PTCGO, we have access to the cards on PTCGO. We really want to know what you guys want to see next. So I want to say it's quite early in the video just to make sure you guys knew about it. I'm going to leave another straw poll down in the description for every single deck you see throughout the next, I think it's about 20 slides. And we just want to know what you guys want to see next. So make sure you go and vote in that. It'll take about 20 seconds. Just vote for the decks you want to see, and we will bring you the updated lists or the new lists based on that. But yeah, heading into, I think it's now the main section of the video.
Yeah, so, well, this is going to be the new entrance in a little bit more detail. So, the strengths of Umbreon Zoroark Eeveelutions, it's really based around type coverage, as I mentioned earlier. Using Vaporeon, Jolteon, and Flareon, all with their little effects, giving your Stage 1 Pokemon that extra typing for when it's useful. It means that Zoroark's Mind Jack does ridiculous numbers for just a DCE, and because you're already playing a thick Eevee line, it just makes sense to play the Umbreon GX. A single Dark Energy means you're rolling, you get straight into a 200 HP Pokemon. You see, as one of the strengths, that it has potential to lock abilities as well. Because Umbreon has the Strafe attack, it may be worth putting 1 or 2 Wobbuffets in your list. That means you're far less worried about item lock. You're also a lot less scared of Decidueye, not only in the early turns swarming the board in the first place, but protecting your lower HP Zoruas and Eevees. So Wobbuffet could be a really cool option in the deck. The flexibility is really cool because you have Zoroark as an attacker, as well as Umbreon that has 3 attacks of its own. The Night Spear attack we know is very, very good as a baseline, as a core for the deck. And having the GX attack as well, being able to get rid of 2 energy from anywhere on the board, can really hurt a few major decks at times. It's essentially the same as flipping 2 Crushing Hammers on the same turn. And for those of you who have played in matchups where people are playing hammers, 2 hammer flips can change games at times. So that as an attack and guaranteeing it is really, really cool. The weaknesses for the deck, like we said, there's a lot of these new decks are ability focused, and this is no different. If you don't have your abilities online, those easy 1-hit KOs become 2-hit KOs that aren't even that reliable because Zoroark can be played around, and Umbreon is only a 90-30 snipe. I know that 90-30 has typically been 2-hit KOs in the past, but with some new GXs with 240, 250 HP, 90-30 is a lot less threatening. So that could be an issue. And also there is potentially a clunkiness issue. I know in the early turns it's very easy to get set up. You get an Umbreon no problem because you just find Eevee and attach a Dark Energy. But it's continuing to keep up with that tempo, making sure that you can get not only your attacker active, but also the correct evolution on the bench. If that gets Lysandered up and KO'd, how you can recover that. These are the things that the deck has to manage, and that is potentially a hiccup for the deck.
Definitely. I feel like the deck really has to, there's a real fine line between making sure you're consistent enough to get all of these things out and dodging the clunkiness side. But with all of the different sort of type coverages, I think all 3 of the evolutions actually cover something pretty important in the format at the moment. So we've usually seen when the evolutions have been used in the past, one of them is omitted just because there's nothing really relevant in the format. But especially with Sun and Moon coming in, I think all 3 of the baseline evolutions are actually really good at the moment. So it does mean you have type coverage on a huge majority of the field. Again, yes, Zoroark can be played around, but it is, at the end of the day, a reliable amount of damage, and you only need 3 or 4 Pokemon on your opponent's bench to be getting these one-shots on these high HP Pokemon anyway if you've got weakness on them. So it's definitely got a lot of potential. Again, just the pure tankiness of getting a 200 HP stage 1 on turn 1 just by finding an energy is nothing to be sort of forgotten about. So I think Umbreon Zoroark Evolutions actually goes into this format in a really, really good place.
Yeah, it goes in a sort of place where there's not really anything that you'd be too worried about playing against. It always seems like it can get itself into a game, and that's always something that decks aspire to be. That's something that we've said of things like YVELTAL Garbodor in the past, and like Turbo Darkrai of the present. It can take on almost every deck in the format, and that's something that's a trait that people want from every deck, pretty much. So yeah. Moving on to Decidueye. Jack, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, Decidueye is another really. It's one of the most sort of hyped cards out of the set from what I've been seeing over the past few days leading up to the set's release. Obviously, Decidueye, his ability lets you drop 2 counters just once per turn. But with multiple Decidueye and the access to Forest of Giant Plants, you can actually really apply pressure from turn 1. It's going to be rare that you get the full 4 setup. It's going to be rare that you even get 3. But if you're getting 2 on turn 1, you're in a pretty good spot because before you've even attacked on turn 2, you've dealt 40 damage or 80 damage sort of wherever you want. So Decidueye himself is just a real powerhouse. His attack seems underwhelming, but paired with the abilities he has, it's just like a muscle band for every Decidueye you have out, but it's more flexible than that. 240 HP is nothing to sniff at at all, and then his Hollow Hunt GX attack means that you can preserve exactly the right resources when you need them, letting you grab all the little pieces you need to finish out a game, or maybe you've had to discard some painful stuff early on. It's just a really, really flexible attack. So yeah, sniping from everywhere is such a huge sort of benefit when you can recover all of these one-off tech cards and things like that to make sure you can keep your Decidueyes alive as long as possible. We've paired it with a lot of different things here. I think me and Joe are still. I think we're changing the list almost every day just because there's so much we want to try with this new Pokemon. We've got Lugia and Trevenant and I guess Tauros himself, just as kind of standard attackers, backup attackers, if you do find yourself using them. All have relatively nice attacks given that they all fit in with the DCE-based engine anyway, and we're running Grass Energy for Trevenant too, so Dark Forest can also be a real problem if you're applying 80 damage pressure from the snipes per turn and then locking something in the active as well. It's really, really synergistic. And then similar to that, we've actually tried out Hoot Hoot. It's been sort of popularized a little bit over the past few days. A few people have been talking about it. Proclaim the Night is essentially Quaking Punch but without the damage, but it's not without the damage when you're doing the damage through abilities. So at that point we're sort of thinking, okay, maybe we can sort of try and have something that Toad did last format, but in this case we've got more flexibility with the damage. We don't have to put this 30 in the active. We can actually just really lock something in the active that can't retreat, you can't attach a floatstone to, and then deal the damage to the bench that way. The big thing with this deck, though, is, again, it's incredibly ability-focused. If the deck doesn't have abilities, it doesn't really function, because at that point, the Decidueye GX is just doing 3 for 90, which, without the backup from its abilities, is really underwhelming, especially as we've literally just seen a different attack do 3 for 90 plus a 30 snipe. You can see that there is a comparison between those, and the only reason that Decidueye sort of got caught with a worse attack was just because of how powerful this ability is. And also, as we said on one of the earlier slides, he's weak to fire along with a few other things going into this format, and Volcanion doesn't seem to be going anywhere. As long as Volcanion's about, Decidueye will have a very, very difficult matchup on its hands. There are sometimes things you can add in that try and help the matchup, but it's never, ever going to be favourable just because of how consistent the Volcanion deck is itself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so frustrating because Decidueye is one of the coolest cards I think I've seen printed almost ever. There are so many options with this card that I'm testing the hell out of it, making sure that, you know, I'm gonna find a way to make this deck work. I'm gonna make it happen at some point. Hoot Hoot has been a one-off that I've loved. Because it gives you win conditions just off of one Pokemon. One card in your deck gives you like so many points in games when you can just steal a win because you've Lysandered, Proclaimed the Night, and from there your opponent's stuck for a few turns having to attach. It even gives you a small percentage win condition against Volcanion, which is hilarious because Volcanion's 3 retreat costs. They rarely ever play Olympia. They're normally Floatstone based. If not, they're playing things like Ropes or Switches. So if you can Proclaim the Night on a 3 retreat Volcanion that has no energy on it, you've bought yourself 3 turns of just sniping away, and that's really, really just so good for you. Like Jack said, some of these just basic Pokemon to slap a DC on and start adding up pressure in the early turns, or just when you need a big blowout turn, that can work. There's so many different techs you can play with Decidueye because of that Hollow Hunt. You can try Hammers out, you could try Healing with Max Potion, almost play like a Warlord build where you just Sky Return loop and have the ability as backup damage. You go into a 240 HP Pokemon with just like a float stone and no energy on it, and it's like a Whale Lord. It's pretty much a whale in terms of that HP. So you can just have max potions in the list, and then have just a few grass energy in there and a few DCE, and then just try and max potion spam, see how that goes. There's so many ways that Decidueye could be played that there's going to be some of them, and some people are going to make this work. I think we're getting a little bit closer, myself and Jack, with our list. So I'm really just intrigued to see how this card turns out. But it just has so many bags of potential again that it's going to work in some regard, I think.
Definitely.
Alrighty. Next up we have Lurantis VILEPLUME. This is one of the lists that I hyped a lot when I first saw the scans of Sun and Moon. I thought Lurantis just on its own looks like an incredible card, and its synergy with VILEPLUME is fairly obvious as well. Being a grass type, because you cycle so much in the early turns with Heavy, Ultra Ball, Acro Bike, Professor Sycamore, you naturally get grass energies into your discard pile. So your turn 1 is not only develop a VILEPLUME, but also an attacker that can set itself up so that you're doing 120 each turn comfortably with its second attack. It's a really dangerous turn 1 lock that when it comes off, it is a very difficult deck to beat. The strengths include all those things: the item block, the high HP that also includes healing for when you actually do get attacked, and also the GX attack, doing 50 times the number of grass energy attached to you. For anyone under item lock knows this, that it's very difficult to set up attackers, let alone multiple. You're happy enough being able to just scrape by getting one attacker going. Well, now Lurantis can just go ahead and blow it up once during the game, and that's pretty much all you need for then. You can just start steamrolling with Lurantis, doing that 120 poke each turn, whilst your opponent is, again, scrabbling to get things going because VILEPLUME's in the way. Weaknesses, again, we're going to say fire weakness. Turn 1 item lock is the ultimate equalizer in a lot of cases, but I think Volcanion is almost not one of them, because it needs so little to present such a threat against Lurantis. It just needs like 1 energy, 1 baby Volcanion, and even if you're steam upping like once per turn, it's presenting enough of a threat as a non-EX whilst also setting up the bench. It feels like that's almost a lost cause. Also, there are those times when you miss the VILEPLUME where you're very sad. You just run into a janky hand. Additionally, as you go through your early turn cycles with Sycamores, Acrobikes, Ultra Balls, there can be those times when you lose one resource too many. Like you lose an Olympia, you lose a Lysander, and after those cards have gone from your deck, you can't recover them, and you need them at some point. Like you just get Lysandered on a target that you can't move, and you end up decking out because you've cycled so much in the early turns. You've only got a 15 card deck. You put yourself to a clock, and you can't win in that time because you've been Lysander stalled. So it's similar to Vespivile in that it puts itself in, you know, a 3 or 4 turn clock to try and win the game. Not really that drastic, but you know what I mean. A short time span to try and win out of the game, because otherwise you'll just deck out.
Yeah, definitely. I think, like you said, it's very, very reminiscent of Vespivile. It's a little bit less all-in, but even it's still all-in enough to sometimes go too far all-in, and it means that sometimes you will, in finding this perfect turn 1, you will actually end up losing the game because of it, because you missed one piece, or you had to discard that 1 extra resource, like we say. Obviously, the turn 1 item lock is brutal, and it can prove a win condition against almost anything itself. So I feel like if there's a deck, if you're a player that likes to sort of go all in or go home, then this is a really, really nice archetype. It really, really sort of complements being able to correctly order things and stuff, which is always a really, really nice skill to have. So yeah, it's a really, really rewarding deck when you've set up this perfect game, but sometimes it can sort of trip over itself and you can miss that last gloom to get into your VILEPLUME or whatever. So yeah, it's definitely not without its weaknesses, but the pure potential of Lurantis paired with your opponent not being able to do much about Lurantis itself through the item lock can definitely prove a really, really sort of strong concept. Next up, we've got AQUABOX, another deck that we have profiled on the channel, and a deck that's sort of a revived archetype. We obviously saw AQUABOX back in the day with Seismitoad, very similar to the four Pokemon we have with Lapras here, but we had Seismitoad Quaking Punching instead. In this case, we've actually got the Lapras GX doing a little bit more damage, going for a more damage-heavy build, but obviously you're not getting that item lock. So there's differences, there's similarities, but there is differences. The first thing to note is how tanky this Lapras can be. With 190 plus access to Fury Belt and Rough Seas, it means that anything that isn't one-shotting us is often really three-shotting us, because if they're trying to two-shot us, we can heal a lot of that damage. We have freedom of movement with Manaphy, meaning that we can get multiple turns out of Rough Seas. We can really make every point of damage as least impactful as possible with all of this free retreat, all of this sort of healing that we have. So it means that our opponent isn't very often going to be constantly taking one shots if they're not easily taking a one shot anyway. Obviously we are weak to grass, so things like Lurantis will be able to just use one attack and knock us out. But if they don't have weakness on us, if our opponent doesn't have weakness on us, a lot of the time they are going to have to really fight for these prizes. Freedom of movement, as I've said, is just really strong. It means that we can't be Lysander stalled. We're always one energy away from having whatever we want in the active. And then reliable energy acceleration. Max Elixir is obviously really nice. Energy switch means that we can really set up these attackers a lot faster than people expect. Another thing to note is the different water attackers we can pair with it. Obviously, we've got Glaceon, Articuno, and Regice, the three sort of main ones that are featured most of the time. And all of them serve their own purpose in against different decks. At the moment, I think Glaceon is one of my favorites, just because I think that a lot of the GXs are being hyped, and a lot of them are evolutions, meaning that Crystal Ray actually gets a real huge amount of value at the moment. But we have access to Articuno and Regice, and it just means it's another thing for our opponent to have to think about. The thing that we have noticed, though, with the list is sometimes it can, again, fall over its own clunkiness a little bit. You'd think with all the freedom of movement and the speedy setup that you sort of, the drawing with the collect attack as well, you sort of set up really quickly and you're never missing things. But sometimes if you just miss that one energy to be able to move out of the active or the E-switch or whatever, or you don't have your abilities or something like that, the deck can really be punished. Again, like we've said with the rest of the decks, it's ability focused, meaning that if your opponent's playing Garb or has something that's stopping your abilities, maybe they've played a Hex or whatever, you're going to be a lot more limited to what you can do for the next turn. And the last point we've noted is that Lapras isn't Seismitoad. One thing that AQUABOX really had going for it was the fact that it was really consistent in setting up and getting all his energy on board and being able to apply pressure in the late game. But in the early game, you were slowing your opponent down through item lock. And this doesn't do that. You do have the access to collect with Lapras, meaning that you are drawing more cards. So in some respects, it's better because you're getting into your different pieces a lot quicker and you're finding your answers and things like that. But you're not you're not item locking, which was a huge selling point for AQUABOX.
Yeah, absolutely. Toad was just so strong. It attacked for 2 energy as well in the early turns and actually put meaningful counters on the board. And Lapras can't really do that, although it does sort of make up for that damage later on with its second attack. Glaceon, yeah, I agree that that's one of the better attacks, Crystal Ray, but also second bite's really good because obviously Lapras can't chain its attack, so free retreating into the Glaceon that only needs 2 energy to finish off things can also be really helpful. So I love AQUABOX. Back in the day, it hasn't changed much in terms of the list itself. I think the biggest thing for me that was really awkward was not having Hooper EX. Seismitoad simply being an EX Pokemon and Lapras not being an EX Pokemon is actually kind of a big deal because one Ultra Ball used to get you Manaphy, Toad, Shaman EX. That's why the AQUABOX deck was so consistent. And you can't really do that now. We sort of have to play a couple of dive balls and it's kind of awkward sometimes because you're sort of sat on your elixirs and your E-switches without finding your Pokemon because one Ultra Ball doesn't get you everything. Sometimes you just have to Ultra Ball for Shaman, start elixiring to that and hoping to hit switches later on. So those sort of things are teething issues with the list. But I can definitely see it causing a lot of problems for decks in the current metagame. I can see it causing problems for Volcanion. I can see it being really awkward for things like YVELTAL, Turbo, Darkrai, because those are decks that try and do stable 2-hit KOs, and when you have Fury Belt, when you have Rough Seas, those stable 2-hits become, like Jack said earlier, 3-hit KOs, and obviously that's going to be really good for you when sometimes you can take 1-hit KOs, if not easily 2-hit KOs that are always 2-hit KOs. So AQUABOX has some good matchups going into the new format. I know that there's a few grass things like LURANTIS and DECIDUEYE, but we do have Glaceon to try and cover for those weaknesses, so that's something to try out. I know DECIDUEYE does a lot via the sniping, but again, Rough Seas can try and mitigate that at some points, and you can play Hex Maniac, of course. So I think AQUABOX is fairly well positioned, even though it's not the best archetype. I think just its positioning and the toys that it has at its disposal make it an appealing deck. Next up we have Solgaleo stuff. Now, this is almost a confession on our point that we've not found the best way to play Solgaleo. One of the most interesting things earlier on was we were looking at Japanese lists that recently were shown on the Facebook site Hey Fonte, and it looked like Japan loved Solgaleo. They were playing Solgaleo with just about anything that they could, and it's a testament to the card. Solgaleo GX is a fantastic card. Its ability is really good, its GX attack is fantastic for setting up energy, and Sunsteel Strike does have 1-hit KO potential on everything out there. When you incorporate Professor Kukui, you go up to 250 damage, nothing surviving that basically. So Solgaleo in itself is just really, really awesome, and naturally people are going to try and build around that. For us, it's been a headache, really, trying to figure out the best way to play him. We've tried just having a few metal types in there, and try and go for Hooper, find your metal Pokemon, Soul Burst onto them all, and then have the option to Sunsteel Strike a lot. We've thought about going for DCE decks like Lugia, because essentially Soul Burst can then bring out not only 5 energy, but technically it's like 8 energy when you take out the DCEs, and also 1 extra energy on top of that. Similar for Double Dragon Energy, you could try it to accelerate something like a Darkrai deck where it loves having lots of energy on the board. If you Solgaleo Soul Burst 4 Double Dragons into play, well, Darkrai is going to be having a field day with its damage output, which is really awesome. One hilarious thing that Jack found today, he opened an Elite Trainer box, because today's the release day of Sun and Moon, and under Solgaleo GX it says, why not try pairing it with Lurantis GX? Because you have Ultra Road, you Sunsteel Strike, you Ultra Road your way the following turn into Lurantis that Flower Supplies Solgaleo once again to set him up again for the next turn. It sounds like a really cool play, and although it's one that we've given 0 testing time, if the Elite Trader box says it's good, then who knows, maybe it could be good. In all seriousness, the weaknesses of this deck, it can be clunky, it is a stage 2, everyone knows that those problems arise when you whiff the candy, you whiff the Pokemon, whatever else, then you're very sad, you get set back entirely because the deck is so focused on this one Soul Burst GX attack that basically your game hasn't begun until you've done Soul Burst GX, in a similar way to Greninja, where your deck hasn't even started to function until you use Water Duplicates. It feels very much the same way for Solgaleo. Additionally, Ultra Road is a fantastic ability, but if it's shut off, that's a problem, because he's clunky, and some of the other Pokemon you try and pair him with is heavy retreat cost-wise as well. And there's that also the big old issue of being weak to fire, which means Volcanion is going to have a field day as well.
Yeah, Solgaleo is, I think, at this point, hands down, whilst it may not be the most competitive and the one I've tested the most, my favourite GX in the set. And it's just, as Joe said with the Japanese list, it's a testament to how good the card is. We know this card is good. Everyone knows this card is good. It's just waiting for someone to make the right list. And if you have the right list that can deal with some of these weaknesses, you can get around the Volcanion matchup somehow. You can consistently get your Solgaleos out. I think this card has such huge potential. Soul Burst GX is insane. Sunsteel Strike, again, like we've said, with Kukui, can one-shot absolutely anything in the format. And it's so close, I feel, to being one of the best archetypes in the format. we just need to find that tipping point, I think, and I'm determined to make this card work, but I don't know whether it's right just yet. Next up, we have Passimian, a new sort of non-EX style deck, one that's actually kind of in some ways reminiscent to Night March, in that it's consistent, it applies early pressure, and everything is one prize. So Passimian does more damage for each Passimian you have on the bench. Pair that with Mew, you can have 4 Passimian on the bench, doing 130 for just the DCE, which is just huge for just one attachment. You can really be applying pressure even on the turn 1. If you manage to find your Passimians early enough, you can just throw them all down. You're often going to be going down to a low hand size just to be able to dig through and cycle through your deck, so you can pair it with the other new monkey from the set, Oranguru, to keep drawing your cards. It means that you're not really weak to N as well, and a lot of the time your sort of win condition is on the board anyway. So when your opponent may be ending you, yeah, you may have to dig for 1 or 2 more cards, but a lot of the time N isn't going to be too much of an issue for the deck at all. Pairing it with Bursting Balloons means that even when your opponent's taking these easy prizes on Mews with only 50 HP, they're still taking a chunk, 60 damage as well, meaning any EX that is hit by Mew with 4 Passimian on the bench that then pokes a Bursting Balloon is going to be knocked out, providing they're not running Fury Belt. So it means that this sort of competes with these EX attackers. This non-EX deck competes with the EX attackers, and that's one of the biggest selling points for Passimian, how consistent it is and how easily it can win the prize trade. And the big thing is, obviously, we have kind of a low damage cap, meaning that we can have a maximum of 4 Passimian on the bench, meaning that we can only do a maximum of 130 sort of base damage. And whilst that may seem good for a DCE, when your opponent is sort of guaranteed a prize every turn, sometimes it's not quite good enough. Another thing to note is it is DCU reliant, as I've been saying, and any deck that's Special Energy Hate will be really, really strong against this deck. Simply, it's one of those decks where you play for DCE, that's the only energy you play, you never attach twice to try and set up a Passimian because it's not worth the time you've spent attaching. You're better off just throwing on a DCE. Obviously, you can run things like puzzles to get them back, special charge, but it's worth noting that if you are DCE reliant and with a low damage cap, sometimes these two things may coincide enough to mean that you can't overtake some of these more difficult matchups.
Yeah, definitely. It means it falls prey to things like healing decks, where they go and max potion on you, then you've wasted turns of doing nothing, basically. The DC Reliance is frustrating because it's only 4 cards in your entire deck that you're digging for every single turn. We have teammates, we have puzzles to recycle it, to make it as consistent as possible, but even missing 1 turn can be enough to lose the game, because Passimian walks that tightrope. 130 a turn is probably enough to win you a lot of games, but if you ever miss that, then it's pretty much over. On the flip side, Passimian seems to be the ultimate deck that can punish anyone that doesn't start well enough. If they miss a turn, if they're trying to end you and they've missed a thing, or if they just had a slow turn 1, Passimian just wins. I think it's impossible to lose if you're Passimian and you've been given 2 turns of freedom to do your own thing. I think you just start steamrolling too often. So I personally think this is a good enough deck in the format, just on that alone, because there are so many games when people do miss things. They miss their turn 1 attachment, they miss a supporter, they can't find Ultra Ball, they can't find the stadium, they can't find that one piece that makes them keep rolling. And Passimian keeps that pressure on every single turn. I'm guaranteeing this much damage and putting a Bursting Balloon on top of that a lot of the time. Some decks just sort of fall to that amount of early pressure. Anything trying to be too greedy and too setup based, I think Passimian can prey on. So for me, it's a good archetype. It might be one of these ones that we have to wait till choice banned, and then it gets much, much better. But right now I can still see it seeing some play. Next up we have Straight Lurantis. This is one that we've not actually yet put on the channel, but it's another way of thinking about Lurantis, really. It's almost taking the concept of Virizion Genesect from way back when and splicing that with the idea of Mega Sceptile, where you have lots of healing. We know Lurantis already has healing in its own attack, but you can also try out max potions, because of course you have so much great energy acceleration from the discard pile. It can almost function like a Mega Manectric EX deck. So these are 3 decks that I've just mentioned that have all been successful in the past. Therefore, there's no real reason why this can't work again, because 210 HP is a decent amount. We have good acceleration. We have 1-hit KO potential at times, or one time during each game, so we can overcome a big threat if it comes down to it, which is very cool. The Ariados helps out getting you to 210 HP or 160 or 170 if they stay poisoned, so that can be a nice little math fixer. It means that your 40 damage poke again becomes a bit more relevant because poison can start adding up very quickly. You can use the EX Trevenant that we've already mentioned. Dark Forest is a decent and sometimes frustrating attack, as well as Wood Blast being a decent finisher sometimes. I think the cornerstone really is that it's going to be a very simple deck. It's going to be like 4/4 Lurantis, 1/1 Ariados, 1 Trev, 2 Shaman, and then you just have space. You have like 10 or 11 energy, I guess, and then the rest of it's space to do whatever you want. You'll have heavy, VS Seeker, Ultra Ball, Mail, Forest. You'll just get going a lot of the time, and hopefully that sort of healing aspect will be enough to win you games. And I can definitely see it being frustrating for things like Umbreon, YVELTAL, Darkrai, which will like to hit between these 2-hit KOs. Just using Max Potion is going to be very, very awkward for those decks, so that's a pretty cool option in my opinion. And again, it's just showing off Lurantis. It doesn't need any fancy tricks, doesn't need to have the VILEPLUME to be good enough, so why not just try it on its own. Weaknesses again, fire. You just can't beat fire. It's not only that they one-hit you, it's that you can't even respond on them. I know a few people have debated playing Lurantis EEVEELUTIONS. That's an avenue that we're personally not fully behind, because we feel like it can A, clunk up the deck, and B, it can be shut down by Garbodor, C, they can just KO it as the Volk player, and again you're in square one basically. So we don't think Lurantis is ever going to have a great Volcanion matchup really, and also its damage cap can be manipulated, just like we're using Match Potion. Other decks can be doing that as well, and if we're trying to do this healing stalling thing, a lot of the time we're forced to use our first attacks, Flower Supply, so really we're only doing 50 or so a turn if you incorporate Ariados in there. So its damage is questionable a lot of turns in the game.
Yeah, the deck's more about trying to outvalue the opponent and trying to make them work more for their 2 prizes than you are for yours. I think Ariados is a huge math fixer. I'm just sitting here looking at the numbers, and Ariados fixes so many numbers. But even so, I struggle to see at the moment, with the current pool of cards we have, maybe in 2 or 3 sets time, this is going to be different. But with the current pool of cards, I don't see how this beats Volcanion, and I think that in itself is a huge concern to me. Next up, we have, this is the last of the new decks, is Umbreon Espeon Hammers, another one that we again have profiled on the channel. The other Umbreon build, sort of focusing more on energy denial and damage manipulation, that kind of thing. We're focusing less on the hitting for weakness and more getting the most value out of this 90-30 damage sort of spread, being able to use the Division GX attack with Espeon GX to then place these final 10 counters exactly where you need them, to then finish the game out with Espeon's Miraculous Shine to hopefully take some easy prizes, things like that. We're also running sort of a Crushing Hammer style build as well, if we want to go down that route for things that don't play heavy evolutions. So that's when you're going to be using the Umbreon GX attack instead. Obviously, also in a deck like this where you're going to be running Psychic Energy and you have Strafe available, we do again have Ability Lock available through Wobbuffet. So it definitely can present an issue for many different things. I think the biggest sort of thing with this deck is how many different play styles it can play. It can play the Ability Lock, stop your opponent from winning that way game. It can play the take cheap prizes on just putting like 80 or 90 damage on some of your opponent's GXs, and then Miraculous Shining. At least if you're getting 2 or 3 GXs from that, whilst you're not taking 6 prizes, you're taking all of their attackers off the field at once. And if you can survive to that point to be able to do that with the Espeon, and it's unlikely that your opponent's going to be able to recover from that position. There are decks that can do that. Things like Decidueye obviously has Revitalizer to then drop it all straight back down. Yeah, sure, but that is in itself is enough of a hindrance to be able to win against some of these other awkward matchups. And then, like I said, we've still got the Crushing Hammer sort of style of denying your opponent's energy and winning through that way. The biggest issue is the damage output. You're kind of limited to 90 with Umbreon. You're never going to be doing much more because we don't have access to the weakness. Obviously, Espeon's damage does scale with your opponent, so you can be doing more damage, yes, but your opponent is controlling the damage. So they've just got to not attach that one extra energy so they know they're not getting knocked out. And at that point, you're trading on a 2-hit war, but you're more often not going to be using a lot more resources than them. Consistency issues is again another thing. Just because it's 2 stage 1s and you're going to have Wobbuffet out, and sometimes it's going to be active, so you're not going to be able to shame in yourself. You're not going to be able to use Eevee's ability yourself if you can't get this Wob out the active. So even those little things do cause consistency issues to the deck. And finally, there's no real acceleration. It does take 2 attachments to set up the Umbreon. It does take 2 attachments to set up the Espeon. There's no cheap way of attaching energy for these guys at the current point in time. So it can sort of lose just from being a little bit too slow in the current format. Obviously, the format hasn't slowed down at all yet. I think we are going towards a slower format, but with all of these EXs and Max Elixir and things like that still in the format, we are still in a very, very sort of hyper-aggressive format. And even that 1 extra energy per turn may just mean you're 1 turn behind, and that 1 turn could mean that you're not quite going to make it through the prize race.
Yeah, absolutely. Personally, I've loved energy denial and hammer decks for a while. I'm always going to keep trying to make these sorts of disruption decks. I think Umbreon GX's attack fits perfectly into a list like this, and having the versatility to use the other Espeon GX as well is nice for covering typing and weaknesses, and offers so much more to the deck as well. Even confusion is something that shouldn't be slept on. If you're crushing away lots of energy and throwing confusion into the mix, it's just lots of awkward things being thrown at the opponent all at once, and I think it's going to be an annoying deck to play against for almost anything. I can't think of a deck that would love to play against Umbreon Espeon Hammers. Maybe something like straight Lurantis, but that's just about it because it has so much acceleration on its own side. But everything else feels like it would really struggle against this sort of deck, so I think it's going to be a decent contender for sure. Maybe right now it's trying to do too much in our list that we put on the channel. Maybe it has to be simplified a little bit. We need to sort of reel it back in because we're trying out this, this deck that has so many options to beat so many things. Maybe we do have to simplify down a little bit, but I do think that this can work because there's just so much going for it, in my opinion. Okay, so let's go back to the start. Let's revisit the decks that we mentioned earlier on. This is still the pre-Sun and Moon stuff, and now we're going to go into their impact of Sun and Moon on these decks. So really, we're going to be highlighting 3 or 4 different things here. We're going to see the decks that are declining, the decks that are thriving, the decks that are adapting, and the non-movers as well. There are some lists that gain nothing, gain no new favourable matchups, and no new cards, and will just sort of be in limbo for a little bit more and remain where they are. But typically, when new decks come into the fray and affect our metagame, it's going to mean a few things. It means some decks get new auto losses or bad matchups. Some are going to naturally get good matchups or good cards that improve their lists. And some decks are going to say, well, this thing's now in the format, so I probably need to adjust my strategy unless I want to take the loss to this deck. So these are the sort of things that you have to keep looking at with a game like Pokemon that is continually moving. Every 3 months we get a huge batch of new content and new cards to keep the game fresh, and it's a really interesting way to see how the game develops basically and how decks continue to succeed.
So yeah, looking at sort of we've now categorized each of the decks that we had on the previous slide into what kind of gets worse, isn't going to disappear, but what maybe loses some matchups, or there's something that sort of goes down in play for this deck to be as viable as before. what decks are adapting and looking at the new 8 decks that we've just talked about and said, okay, I'm going to add this, this, and this to be able to deal with this, this, and this. What decks are thriving that just get more and more good matchups? For example, Volcanion, we've just said 4 of the decks that we've spoken about in the past sort of 40 minutes have all been weak to Volcanion. So Volcanion's in a really good position. And then, as we've said, the non-movers, nothing that they don't gain anything, they don't lose anything. They're good decks. They continue to be good decks going into, and they just gain some new matchups that they have to work out. So moving into the first one, obviously, Yveltal Garbodor was king of the format, now has seen sort of a decline in play. It's not disappeared, but it's taking a backseat for a while. I think we're talking, I should mention we're now talking about the Thrivers, and Yveltal Garbodor just carries on doing well. It gains a couple of favourable matchups, but more than anything, it gains the ability to Ninja Boy into Tauros to take this two-shot knockout war. Just go insane for one turn, get a one-shot, push yourself ahead in the prizes, and push yourself so far ahead that your opponent can't keep up with you by the time you're going to have taken all 6 of your prizes. So for each of these slides, we're going to have new additions for the deck, new favourable matchups, and moving forward, how we think you're going to adapt the deck list maybe. There's going to be no specific lists in this video because we want to have specific videos for each list, but we're going to have more of sort of some theory on where these lists are going to go. So yeah, as I've mentioned, Tauros GX is one of the biggest cards for Yveltal. Being able to Ninja Boy into a Yveltal EX that's just taken a Y Cyclone or another sort of low damage hit that your opponent's expecting to finish off next turn. Tauros GX for just 1 DCE can knock out pretty much anything, provided you've got at least 6 or 7 damage counters on you. Obviously, it does 30 damage times the number of damage, so as long as you're reaching that boundary, you're going to be fine. Team Skullgrunt is a nice little one-of supporter. We've seen Flare Grunt do well in the past. Skullgrunt is very similar to that. It's going to be more reliable at times. It's going to be less reliable at times, but it's definitely one for people to try out. Nest Ball is a fantastic 5th ball search card, not just solely for Yveltal, just in general, but it doesn't at all dislike it, especially when there's a lot more emphasis on getting your Garb out early. Having that 1 extra Nest Ball means that you can search for that second Trubbish right at the end of your turn. And then finally, Kukui, meaning that you can, even just with Yveltal, push into these 1-hit KOs every now and again just to close out a game a little bit quicker.
Yeah, absolutely. We just know that Yveltal Garb is just one of the gold standards of a good deck. It has energy, acceleration, and retention thanks to Y Cyclone. We just know how efficient Yveltal EX is. That hasn't changed. And Garbodor shuts off a large portion of the format, so the deck is still going to be really good. Looking at some favourable matchups that it picks up, Passimian becomes fairly easy because shutting down the Mew is going to be great for you, and then also having resistance on the Passimians when they're forced to attack with Passimian is also going to be pretty beneficial. And Lurantis VILEPLUME, we're putting as a favourable matchup, and this is really because if you're playing 2 Tauros GX, that is going to be really difficult even if the opponent is able to go first and set up turn 1 VILEPLUME with Lurantis. So if they're living the dream, they still have the headache of dealing with Tauros GX. Because Tauros on its own, even if it's just in the active with 0 energy attached, it's going to be posing a threat to Lurantis. It puts the question in the opponent's player's mind, do I actually have to GX attack through this guy so that I don't just lose the Lurantis that's currently in my active? So he poses a threat in that regard. You can Ninja Boy at any time. That's going to be really good for you. And if you're the one going first, if you play a thick enough Garbodor line, which as you can see moving forward, we believe a very thick Garbodor is going to be the way to go and almost a key to this format. Going to a 3-2 Garb and having 4 Floatstones means that you can easily develop Trubbish Floatstone turn 1 very often, and then you can point back to your opponent and say, go ahead, do your VILEPLUME shenanigans, next turn I'm shutting it off and I won't be affected at all. So that's going to be another, in my eyes, favourable matchup. Furthermore, with the deck, we have the Ninja Boy Tauros combo, and it feels like we're moving away from Fright Night, more for the fact that there are going to be these GX decks in the format. If it's a GX deck, Fright Night becomes far less useful. Now, the ability is still fairly frustrating for a few decks. There will still be Megas in the format, I imagine, but I think Fright Night goes from a one or two of to sometimes a one of, if the format demands it. And I think for space more than anything, if you're making room for the Tauroses and the Ninja Boys and upping your Garbodor counts, I think Fright Knight seems to be a more natural cut than anything else in the deck.
Yeah. Next up, we have Volcanion. I think it's probably the deck we've mentioned the most so far. This deck is again in our Thrivers section simply because of mainly the matchups it gains. New additions card-wise, it gains Professor Kukui, meaning that if you do choose to run Kukui, which I'm not 100% sold on yet, it's a card that I think I really need to play a bit more with. But it means that it can save you steaming up that one extra time, or it can mean that if you can't steam up again, you still have a little bit of a boost of damage just before you announce your attack. And then Nest Ball is another nice just 5th ball search card. Means that you can quite reliably get a few Volcanion EX out in the early turns, even if you've ended up prizing your Hooper or anything like that. I think Nest Ball just sort of can, whilst it doesn't completely sort of absorb that problem, it can mitigate that to an extent. Favourable matchups, as we've said, Lurantis VILEPLUME and Lurantis in general, if they're running the straight build. The thing with Lurantis VILEPLUME, yes, you are being item locked, and yes, Volcanion is an item heavy deck, but the fact that your baby or your non-EX Volcanion can do so much damage or has weakness, and you have the ability to steam up to power that one up as well, it means that even once they've got through this normal Volcanion that's probably taken 2 prizes himself, just power heatering and getting steam up at the right time and stuff, by then you've set up a Volcanion EX for your opponent to then have to deal with, or at least one of them. So it means that even the non-EX is a threat. Decidueye, again, another one that's weak to fire and presents a threat. The non-EX presents a threat as long as you're not missing absolutely all of your elixirs and you're not being able to attach no energy with power heater and stuff like that. I think it's a relatively easy matchup. And Solgaleo still gets one shot by a non-steamed up volcanic heat from Volcanion. So all of these things have weakness to fire, which is hugely beneficial for Volcanion.
Yeah, all pretty simple stuff. We know that in a few of our lists we've shown on the channel, we've been teetering around with weakness policy. Maybe that's the only answer we have to Volcanion. It's a pretty sad state of affairs that might be the only answer to fix these sorts of matchups. But for Volcanion, it's just doing the same things that it's always done. It's just now the person sat opposite you is playing a deck that's more likely to be favourable for you than unfavourable. I think Volcanion, since it came out, it's sort of been having to fight off and fend off matchups that should be difficult. When it first came out at Worlds, it managed to come 10th and 11th, even though AQUABOX was the most popular deck day one, and there was also loads of Night March. Like, it's kind of incredible how Volcanion's been able to keep up against the odds a lot of the time. So now that the odds seem to be turning in its favour, maybe it just means that people don't play the grass stuff, and it just means like, oh, Lurantis is really cool, but I can't play it because Volcanion's too popular. But it looks like if people want to be trying out these new decks, because some of them are very powerful, Volcanion can have a field day just hitting the right matchups and just doing its normal shenanigans, but this time it's doing ×2 damage for its efforts. Next up we have Mega Rayquaza. Mega Ray doesn't change too much. However, again, it feels like it's one of these decks that gains some new, easier matchups. In terms of new cards, it gains Professor Kukui, so now you can actually Emerald Break above 240, so you can actually one-hit KO Warlords, which is fun. But also it's more like hitting things like Solgaleo GX and stuff. It also gains Oranguru, which I think will only ever be a one-off for Mega Rayquaza, but it's something that can chill on your bench for when you get to the late game, and you can try and draw those few extra cards to dig into things like Dragonite or Shaman or Hooper, whatever else, to get yourself going, find your final pieces to win the game. You gain a few favourable matchups, and I think really the case is a lot of the new decks coming out really require their own stadium, therefore they can't play Parallel City. Lurantis and Decidueye, these builds need to play Forest of Giant Plants. AQUABOX needs to play Rough Seas. Passimian plays Skyfield of its own. And that means that the sort of recovery that Rayquaza normally has to deal with, normally has to worry about Parallel City and all these different types of decks that can splash it in, well, all the new archetypes can't really do that. They can't just answer with Parallel City. So until Sudowoodo comes out, it feels like Rayquaza can be sitting pretty in a lot of cases where it can just Emerald Break for everything, and your opponent can't really stop you doing that. Professor Kukui actually fixes things additionally because you're not capped at 150 when you don't have a Skyfield in play. You actually push yourself to 170, which is pretty cool. Moving forward, as we say, the list overall won't change much. Kukui probably goes in, and as does Oranguru. Other than that, you can just choose your favourite builds. Metal, when it's appropriate, when there are things like Jirachi promo being played and whatever else. I think it also protects you from Umbreon GX, so the Metal build might be the most important thing here. Otherwise, just play Jolteon because it's a free retreater, and that's just 2 extra good starters in your list otherwise, so yeah.
Yeah, nothing much else to say about Ray. It's one of those decks that if you forget about it, it's going to pop up and you're going to be taking an Emerald Break for 240 a lot of the time, so don't forget about this guy at all. Next up, moving into sort of the non-movers, the decks that just are okay. They don't lose anything, they don't gain anything, they're just still good, is Mega Gardevoir. Obviously, new additions. Professor Kukui means that we can push for a couple of other nicer numbers. There's nothing huge, there's nothing like major that it gains other than Kukui, but sort of matchups wise, there are, as we've said, a couple of new dark decks coming into the fray, and Gardevoir loves playing against these dark decks just because you have resistance. You're doing pretty much good damage against a lot of them anyway. Obviously, you have to use the right Gardevoir for the right matchup, but it's able to deal with almost anything in the format. And Decidueye, obviously, they apply a lot of pressure early, but if you're able to set up a Primal Clash Brilliant Arrow Gardevoir with enough energy, you can take out a Decidueye a turn, and whilst they have been applying a lot of pressure early and sort of taking prizes early, you very quickly overrun them. And if you can take out 3 Decidueye in 3 turns before they're able to take their 6 prizes on EXs, there's no real good targets for them to hit in this deck. It's not like you're playing your own 60 HP basics they can just abuse and take quick prizes on turn 1 and 2. Everything has a pretty chunky HP. So it means that if you set up your Brilliant Arrow enough, you are going to be one-shotting these things eventually. Moving forward, the split build that runs both the Brilliant Arrow and the Despair Ray seems to be the best build. Despair Ray isn't as useful anymore, especially as you're not well, the 2 shots aren't always as consistent with the 250 HP dudes that sometimes have resistance on you and things like that. But also being able to apply so much more damage with the Primal Clash Guardi is the biggest thing. It means that you can eventually, after building up a board state, get to the point where you can just take 4 prizes in 2 turns if your opponent can't knock you out.
Yeah, absolutely. Having the fairy drops and 1 or 2 Hex Maniacs probably means that Decidueye should be manageable. I'm a fan of the split mega builds. Obviously, it's what I played in Leipzig. I'm still a fan of this list over the regular Despair Ray builds, and we've said a lot that there's going to be these heavy ability-focused decks. Decidueye, Volcanion, AQUABOX, all of these sort of things that need to have abilities, which just naturally means that Garbodor is going to be huge. And if you're expecting lots of Garbodor, then the heavy Despair Ray, Dragonite Hooper Shaman build just becomes a lot less appealing. So stay clear of that, in my opinion. I know a lot of people just think the Brilliant Arrow one's trash, but trust me, I think it's a decent enough deck. And other than, obviously, Solgaleo is an awkward one. Other than Ray and Rainbow Force, I think Mega Gardy has a long list of favourable matchups, in my opinion. Next up, we actually do have Rainbow Force. This is the deck that I just mentioned. And again, it's one that's fairly unchanged. We've said Nest Ball a lot of the time. And this is a really good one for Xerneas. It might even be like a 2 of alongside your 4 Ultra Ball, because it's so important to get down your Xerneas's, not only in the active position, but also on the bench, so you can attach EXP Share onto it, or you can just start getting your elixirs, firing them off as quickly as possible to thin the deck of these clunky cards. Also, Oranguru, although we do play Shaman, obviously, as your colourless type in Rainbow Force, you could also choose to play one Oranguru for those times when Skyfield is bounced, Shaman goes, Oranguru stays, and he can protect you from N later on in the games, because as we all know, Xerneas does sort of go aggressive in the opening turns. The only real way to come back from Rainbow Force is N, KO their active, hope they don't set up again. And Oranguru can try and recover you in those sorts of spots. Favourable matchups include Decidueye, because Rainbow Force can get to that huge amount of output. Their only counter stadium is Forest, and that doesn't really prevent you enough in terms of your output, in my opinion. I'd say AQUABOX, again, is typically quite easy, because you can get over those numbers quite comfortably, and straight Lurantis also, you can just wipe them out. Basically, decks that don't like being one-hit KO'd, guess what? Rainbow Force can get one-hit KOs, so you're going to be sitting pretty. And then, moving forward, the deck literally is unchanged. It gains... I think you make space for 2 Nest Ball. I think that's about all you need to change. Oranguru is questionable. I'd consider it. I'd have to playtest it to make sure it was worthwhile. It might not end up being that case, because it is a tight list, Rainbow Force, but I think Nest Ball is definitely worth including.
Yeah, it's just more of the same. Rainbow Force has always been a deck that if it sets up and it can stream 3 attackers, then it wins. If it can't, it loses. If your opponent manages to take or put you in a position where you have to draw into the exact hand you need to be able to win, then it can sort of suffer at that. But that's nothing to do with Sun and Moon. It gains some new favourable matchups, but it's not like the deck hugely changes because of it. Next up, we have Mega Mewtwo, another one that's kind of just always been here, always been in the back of our minds, always able to produce results as and when people actually forget about it and don't really sort of expect this deck. Obviously, we've mentioned that the other Mega Guardi, the one that is obviously a huge problem for this deck, seems the list based around that seems to be the lesser useful list to play, meaning that your Mega Guardi matchup, whilst still being hard, it's not going to be just a complete it's just not anywhere near as awful. Like the old Mega Guardi list, it stomped Mewtwo. But now with that seeing a decline in play, Mewtwo definitely has the space to come back into popularity. New additions, again, as we've said with a lot of these decks, Kukui can just be a math fixer every now and again. You can't find your last Mega Turbo, or you have to attach a Psychic instead of a DCE. Kukui can just push you into that knockout range again. It's something that we've said multiple times. It's just a really, really good card. Favourable matchups, Passimian and Decidueye. Passimian kind of obviously with actually I'm pretty sure Shattershot with 2 energy can one-shot a Passimian, which is kind of hilarious. But they just can't deal with this 210 HP that is one-shotting them every turn.
That's obviously you have to remember that's once Garbodor's developed. Otherwise, Mew stomps you.
Yeah, Garbodor is important in the matchup, but then it's the same for Decidueye. As long as you're getting your Garbodor up, it means that they're not applying this extra 80 damage per turn potentially, meaning that they're just doing 90 for 3 each turn, and at that point, Psychic Infinity just takes over the game. Moving forward, again, the list's pretty unchanged. There's no huge differences. Finding space for one Kukui shouldn't be too difficult. There's probably slots that are reasonable to take out. It's just a deck that has done good in the past and I think doesn't lose much at all.
Yeah, it's an archetype some people just back and they just love it. They just love the option to damage change. It is going to be frustrating for decks like Lurantis. It's sort of like a healing matchup against one another. If you can damage change more, if they can max potion and then just time their GX attack well enough, basically. There's going to be other 2-hit KO decks. It has to compete with Umbreon and also has to compete with Darkrai. I'd say those are fairly even. It's in the Dark players' ball. The ball's in their court really to make the math work out for them, whereas Mewtwo just sits there trying to impose itself enough to win those games. But I think it has a good amount of close to even matchups that you can tech for. This is a deck that can play parallel, that can have the thick Garbodor to help out a lot of matchups, and I think those traits are just not changing really for Mewtwo. Like we say, the list doesn't change much. Kukui, if you can find the space, goes in. It's hard to say that one card is something that you can't find space for, but Mewtwo is one of the tightest lists I think we have in the entire format right now. So much so that some people are playing 2-1 Garbodors just for space reasons. But yeah, Mewtwo is still going to be a contender in the format for sure. Next up we have Turbo Darkrai, and we're moving into the decks that have to adapt to the new format. Turbo Darkrai used to be a deck that could just play 4 Darkrai, 2 or 3 Shaman, 1 Hooper, 2 Yveltal, and could play Silent Labs to shut down abilities from Volcanion and not really have to worry about anything else, because the sheer speed and the rush of energy should just, you sort of ride that wave to beat a Greninja player. Well, there are more abilities to be worried about in this format. There's going to be Vileplume, there's going to be Decidueye, so the Silent Lab is going to be that helpful, whereas Garbodor, we think, is the way to go forwards with this list. We've put it on the channel very recently. I think that's pretty much a tournament-ready list, to be honest, because we know how good Turbo Dark has been. The Garbodor list has been played a lot in Europe. I know that the US lists were quote-unquote more turbo because they were fully basic and had just Silent Lab, whereas the European list adopted Garbodor instead. I feel the Garbodor is the more safer route to go for now that we have Sun and Moon things with so many abilities around. Additionally, it's one of these decks that can have the Tauros Ninja Boy combo in there, because you're already putting 2 energy on all of your Darkrai anyway, and you're expecting to tank 2 hit KOs. Just flip one of those 2 hits into a 1 hit KO thanks to 1 supporter for the turn, and you change games on that basis alone. It also means that going second against Lurantis Vileplume, just like we mentioned with Yveltal Garb, just throwing the Taurus in the active being a huge threat, it's gonna buy you turns, if not help you win the game ultimately. So yeah, Turbo Darkrai has been a popular archetype right towards the release of Sun and Moon, and it's going to continue to be really strong.
Yeah, I think it slightly changes. I think, like we've been saying, you just need to fix in this Garbodor line, but I don't think it takes anything away from the deck at all. And again, with Tauros GX, it's just another thing for your opponent to play around. And the deck's so consistent and sets up and has so much pressure already. Having another thing to think about can sometimes overwhelm different decks. Like they can't do X, Y, and Z because they have to deal with A, B, and C, and because of that, they create a really awkward win condition that they can never really meet. Next up, we have Vileplume Box, one that sort of dropped off the radar a little bit, but actually gains Tauros GX, which is a really, really good card, because it just takes a hit and deals it back a lot harder, and that's what whilst under Vileplume Lock, that's really, really difficult to deal with, because you can't then find your float stones to move away and not get knocked out or do anything like that. You can't keep setting up attackers and trying to deal with these Tauroses quickly. You're under item lock. It means that you're not able to consistently deal with whatever your opponent's throwing at you. You've also got access to, obviously, all of the old Vileplume things for other specific matchups, but I think Tauros is the big sort of selling point of this deck now. Favorable matchups, obviously Lurantis Plume hates to deal with multiple Tauros, and the fact that you're playing Vileplume anyway means that you're not bothered by their item lock. So at that point, you're running a card that actually Lurantis really struggles to deal with, especially if you're running at least a 2 count. It means that they can only GX to blow up 1, and at that point, they've still got another to deal with, and you still have your GX attack able to use, especially with Ninja Boy as well, as we've put in the moving forward part. It means that if you're able to Ninja Boy in the right turns, even whilst under Vileplume Lock, if you're able to find that Ninja Boy and use it on the right turns, it can really, really it can really, really be difficult for Lurantis Vileplume to deal with. Umbreon Zoroark EVs is another one that really, one doesn't really appreciate item lock all that much. It's quite an item focused deck. You've obviously got your float stones, all of that sort of stuff to maximize your abilities. you're not really hitting anything for weakness, and at that point your Tauroses are taking 90 and you're putting 30 somewhere else. But your Tauruses can then use that 90 and one-shot them if they want to with their GX attack. The GX attack for the Umbreon, whilst it may seem kind of good if you're a full special energy deck, all you need is one DC attached to your Tauros. So even if they go down the try and go through the energy denial route, they're only often going to you can augment it so they're only actually ever getting rid of one DCE anyway. And as long as you can find a second DCE, you can just carry on doing what you're doing with Tauros.
Yeah, absolutely. I just love the new face of Plumebox. I think it still plays its Jolteon, its Glaceon, maybe even the Regice still. Still play Manaphy. It'll play all those things. Still the same energy count probably. It's just Tauros is a great front man because you're doing at the very least 60 a turn for just one attachment, which is something the deck I felt was lacking a lot of the time. So you can be a bit more proactive in initiating a race and starting to be awkward. And when your opponent is limited to 2 Lysander in an entire game because you're disallowing VS Seekers, they're going to play into Rage and they're going to play into Mad Bull. It's not a question of if, it's just when, really. So it's just a really awkward Pokemon to play around. Even if you're just doing Tauros for the early turns, just poking for 60, they don't want to hit you back. Cool, next turn on Ninja Boy, and guess what? My Jolteon or Glaceon that you now have to deal with is fully healthy because you didn't want to hit into my Tauros in the first place. So it just seems like it's a natural fit into this deck that is already very awkward, and we just throw a new spanner into the works. I think maybe you can simplify Plumebox a little bit. Maybe play just like one Jolteon, one Glaceon, and go heavier on Tauros, and then give yourself more spaces to make your Vileplume more consistent than it used to be. I think that's potentially a way to go down, because Plumebox was never that consistent at turn 1 Vileplume. It was around the 50% mark, whereas looking at other competitors like Lurantis Plume, that's more towards the 70% mark. I think pushing Plumebox towards that sort of number, because we have Tauros, I think that makes it very possible. So don't write out Plumebox. It can sometimes beat the other Vileplume variants, as well as pose a threat to lots of different things. So remember that range is a card, because going into a new format, it feels like people want to make their list brand new and shiny and as consistent as possible. And when they're doing that, they're not playing these sort of tech supporters just because that's a slot that could be a trainer's mail, or it could be an acro bike, or whatever else. If they're not playing rangers, they can be punished by a deck like this. In a similar vein, Walls plus Garbodor. Walls being, we've seen Regice Glaceon Hammers, we've seen Pidgeot Jolteon Garb. These sorts of archetypes are what we're lumping all into one real section, because Tauros, again, like we're saying with Vileplume, playing Tauros as the front man, Garbodor in the background, Parallel Cities, Ninja Boys, choosing whichever's more annoying, Glaceons, Regices, Jolteons, whatever's most annoying at the time, maybe even still playing Pidgeot, just because Tauros is frustrating to deal with. Fury Belted Tauros, 70 poking a turn is relevant, and it only gets bigger when they start attacking into you. They're going to try and be playing around your damage, so you can just Pokemon Center Lady off if they're trying to do little pokes, or you can go big with Mad Bull GX and just destroy their only attacker. So it just forces your opponent into such awkward spots that it's such a simple deck that I feel like it can work quite easily. Having the Garbodor protects you from things like Decidueye, from Vileplume, and again, Tauros is just so frustrating for Lurantis. The numbers just don't work out in Lurantis' favour. So again, it feels like you pick up some nice wins in those regards. Moving forward, I think the thick Garbodor line, again, it's going to be important. Having the Ninja Boy Tauros combo, not only just the Ninja Boy combo, having like 2 or 3 Tauros, almost make him the front man, and have the option to Glaceon or Regice, could be the way forward for this deck. So it's one I want to try out. It's pretty simple and pretty dirty in my eyes, so I think it could be good.
Yeah, Next up, we have Vespiquen Zebstrika Garbodor, a deck that's always adapted to the metagame that it's in. We're kind of lumping Vespiquen variants in general together, but the fact that Zebstrika is the most popular one at the moment means that we're just going to call it that for now. Obviously, that deals with things like Ray and YVELTAL, which are incredibly popular archetypes. So that's why we're going with this. New additions-wise, Umbreon and Espeon are both stage 1s that kind of fit into the deck well. They're heavy Pokemon lines. You can pair them with Vespiquen to apply pressure with them early on, and then finish stuff off with Vespiquen later on once you've sort of gone through all of your evolution pieces and things like that. Gumshoes is actually a really, really nice one line, potentially in Vespiquen. Being able to search the premises, which is his ability name in English, is just nice having that extra little information. It can decide whether you want to N or whether you want to do specific plays or whether you want to hold your hand, things like that. And it's just more Pokemon to fuel your Vespiquen attack if you don't end up using the Gumshoes in that matchup. And Oranguru, obviously another bench sitter that can just avoid you being end out of your last DC or whatever. And again, the big thing about these new additions is the fact that there are more Pokemon that people can pair with Vespiquen. And at the end of the day, all of these Pokemon are a plus power. So all of these things are definitely things to try. We're not saying any of them are better or worse than what we currently have at the moment, but Vespiquen has always been an incredibly adaptable deck, and it's got a lot of versatility to it. So it's worth trying everything and anything we can, because these different Pokemon can help with certain matchups. New favorable matchups. Obviously, AQUABOX is weak to Vespiquen, meaning that the tanky sort of lifestyle of Lapras GX is mitigated by Vespiquen. You need, I think, 10 Pokemon in the discard if they've got a Fury Belt, meaning that for 1 DC and 10 in the discard, which actually isn't as implausible as you think, you're one-shotting their GX attacker quite consistently. Moving forward, it's just completely dependent on the metagame. Vespiquen has always adapted to the metagame, like I've been saying. It throws things in for bad matchups. It takes things out for matchups that aren't seen anymore. So just try this deck and try out some of these new partners with it, and find the list that beats the majority of the metagame that you expect is kind of the rule of thumb with Vespiquen.
Yeah, pretty much the rule of thumb. With the new Evolution GXs, that sort of gives license to play really thick EV lines and then playing 1/1/1 of each, just like we saw with the ZOROARK build. You could quite easily just play Vespi Evolutions as well. It's been one that's fairly popular in the past. It can help out your Volk matchup, which has always been a hindrance to the Vespi Zebra build at the very least. Oranguru has a great ability that can help you out late game, and it also gives you an out finally to an attacker that's non an evolution, so you can actually deal with things like Glaceon in a very slow 2-hit KO war. But that can be useful. Obviously, most Vespiquen builds probably play 1 or 2 ropes anyway, so I feel like you're fairly covered against AQUABOX and other matchups like that. But although HPs are increasing, that makes Vespiquen's life a lot harder. There are still options for you. Gumshoes is cool, and I think because the card is inherently strong, the free retreat is nice. Big Revenge can still get crazy. People are going to make it work, like we have seen it continually do since its release. Next up is Greninja, and frustratingly enough, I think a lot of people have just said, oh, Greninja dies through Sun and Moon. It's just a dead deck. And if there's one thing that Greninja has taught me, it's that it will never die. This deck is still really, really inherently strong. Now, I know that this could actually be the least we see of Greninja for a little while, because there is a lot of grass, and there is going to be a lot of Garbodor. But at the same time, if there's a lot of grass, then there's a lot of Volcanion, then there's a lot of good matchups. So it's one of these things where the deck just sort of still has good and bad matchups, where throughout its career it's already had good and bad matchups. So I think Greninja's still probably going to be okay in the format. I think it can survive. I think new additions, I put Rotom Dex down as a troll. I don't think you actually put Rotom Dex in. It gains nothing. It has a couple of favourable matchups. Depending on how popular Umbreon gets, that could be quite tempting for you. AQUABOX shouldn't be too difficult either, because they're not that crazy focused on racing for prizes unless they play the Articuno. So just having the usual Greninja things. Obviously, I personally hate the consistency side of the deck. I think Jack would be hesitant to play it again at a major tournament also. But that's not to say that other people won't play this deck. It still has so much going for it. Free retreat on all its dudes. Duplicates, when you actually can pull 4 frogs out the deck, is really good. Shadow Stitching, Moonlight Slash, both strong attacks. Splash Energying as well to make sure you keep up with attackers. People have figured out the better way, or like the best ways to play Greninja, and those things aren't really going to change. I think Greninja's slowly been dying anyway because of Turbo Dark and a few other awkward decks, so maybe it's being slowly pushed out the format, but it's not like it's going to completely wipe itself off the face of the earth, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that, like Joe said at the start of the comments about Greninja, never write this deck off. If this deck sets up, it is a powerhouse. It applies so much pressure. It can ability lock, or it can race for prizes. It's just, if this deck sets up, it's one of the best decks in the format. The problem is it's setting up, and as we've said, now it gains now it gains more bad matchups with the grass decks. That can be awkward, especially now that a lot of them can quite easily hit you through 170 HP because of weakness. Obviously, Garb, again, is an issue. There's things you can do to try and mitigate it, but Garb will always be an issue to some extent. As someone that's played Greninja in 2 major tournaments now, one that went well and one that went less than well, I think it's, if I were to play it again, it wouldn't be at the moment. I think if you want to pull the trigger on Greninja, I think you have to wait until Choice Band for it to be as reliable as it has been in the past. But that's another discussion for another day. Next up, we have Mega Scizor, another deck that's in and out of the format. It gains Team Skullgrunt and Professor Kukui, 2 supporters that have seen very similar sort of supporters in the deck before, with Flaregrunt and Giovanni's. These are sort of different versions of them. Kukui is straight up, I think, better than Giovanni's. And Giovanni's was played. So yeah, Professor Kukui is obviously really nice. And then Team Skullgrunt, one Flaregrunt was toyed around a little bit. And pairing the Iron Crusher with Team Skullgrunt, getting rid of two of your opponent's energy from their hand, meaning they have none in hand, and then getting rid of 1 on the active, means that can actually put them really far behind. Sometimes Mega Scizor kind of struggled if you got rid of 1 of their energy, but they just attached again and still knocked you out and still applied pressure. Now you can sort of mitigate that to an extent, especially as you can choose the energy you discard in their hand as well. New favourable matchups. Obviously, we're pairing this guy with Garbodor simply because Garbodor is one of the most essential cards in the format at the moment. If you don't have a way of being able to deal with these ability locks anyway, I think Garbodor is that way. So Decidueye naturally is quite a good matchup if you can establish your Garb. Again, we're suggesting probably a thicker line simply because Decidueye can actually deal with just 1 Trubbish on turn 1. All they need to do is pop 1 set of 2 damage counters on it and wait for them to find Lysander later on in the game. So having a thicker Garb line means that you're going to be more often able to build up this Garb and swing that matchup in your favor. And at that point, you're just outvaluing them. You're discarding their DCs every turn. That's their output at that point. So yeah, that's the biggest thing. Moving forward, obviously, the biggest thing about Mega Scizor is the fact that, again, it's weak to fire. And so far, Volcanion, I think, has had the best matchups across the board, especially at least with the new things coming into the format. So everything that's caught up by Volcanion, Mega Scizor is also caught up in that sort of category. So if you don't think you're going to see Volcanion, then I think you can build your list to be able to deal with the format. But I think it could be a very naive thought thinking that Volcanion won't show up, especially looking at the matchups it gains.
Yeah, definitely. A few of the newer matchups, like dealing with special energy on Decidueyes and Umbreons, are going to be great. We know it can keep up with Rainbow Road and Ray by doing the same things, also getting rid of stadiums, putting in parallels of your own. So Sizzle still has a decent amount of good matchups. It's just getting caught in the whole hype of Volk because there's so much new grass stuff just makes Sizzle want to hide under a cave for a little bit. So I think it's a really ballsy play if you want to keep up with Sizzle. Not that I can't see it taking wins, but it just seems like people are going to be checking for other matchups and choosing to play Volcanion for that reason. And then you flip over a Sizzle and you think, well, I've lost. Because Sizzle, just like Lurantis and Decidueye, have very few win conditions to the Volk player because it's just too damn easy for them. On to Gyarados now. And this deck gains nothing, has no new good matchups, and picks up quite a few bad ones, unfortunately. Has to be concerned with more VILEPLUME being around, has to be concerned with Decidueye, definitely. And even Umbreon, ESPEON, they both have sniping and placing counter potential. These are all such bad news for Gyarados. It's a deck that's so specific in how it functions that it's such an Achilles heel, you know? It can be quickly turned around into an auto-loss situation for Gyarados. And that's the case. A lot of the time, current decks have had to tech for Gyarados if they wanted to beat it. They'd have to throw in an Absol or throw in a Spinder or whatever else. Now, decks just naturally having 60 cards that can beat a Gyarados list makes this rogue deck seem, again, a lot more scary to play.
Yeah, I think the one saving grace for Gyarados at the moment is if Volcanion goes in play, Gyarados destroys Volcanion. So that's the one saving grace it has. But I think if Volcanion goes up in play, it's because Decidueye and VILEPLUME variants have gone up in play, which means with every good matchup, with every extra Volcanion you see, you're going to see a Decidueye or something like that. So there is that. Obviously, we haven't suggested Rotom Dex because it's not a new edition. It's not a good card. I know people will say it is, but I don't think it is, and nor does Joe. So we haven't added that in the new edition simply because it's just not right.
Oh, I missed a troll opportunity. I can't believe it. Anyway, this is the last deck that we're going to be talking about, thank goodness. There's still a couple more slides to go, though, so don't go anywhere.
Stick around.
Darkrai Dragon's Garb. It's quite different in actually its matchups to something like Turbo Darkrai, despite a large portion of the list looking similar. It doesn't gain much. No new matchups that you particularly want to face. There are a few that you can have answers to. There are a few decks that are DCE reliant, so Giratina may seem appealing, but then there are some that are fully basic energy reliant, and also Umbreon, although it is DCE reliant, it can also get rid of both energy at once on a Giratina, and you're super sad. So this is a deck that feels meta dependent in my eyes. If you go to the first tournament and everyone's playing Turbo Dark, Volcanion, and Ray, you're super happy because Salamancer's just going to lick its lips and Beastly Fang all over the place and destroy lots of lives. But then again, if people are playing with the new stuff, like Lurantis and Umbreon that crushes energies off the board so effectively, it's going to be just a worse build and a clunkier build than just Darkrai Garbodor. So the timing of Salamence Garb is going to be interesting. I don't think Salamence instantly becomes the worst card ever now that there are some GX decks. There's certainly going to be still lots of EX focused lists, don't get me wrong. So there's still potential in this list. A lot of people have written off Salamence as soon as Sun and Moons come out, but it's a slower progression than that. It's not like everyone gets rid of every deck ever and just plays Sun and Moon cards. We all know that Volcanion looks well positioned, Ray looks fairly well positioned. Darkrai Garb was the best deck before Sun and Moon, so there's still huge potential for this archetype, I think.
Yeah, imagine if that was the format. As soon as a new set came out, you had to play those cards. That'd be weird. But yeah, Darkrai Dragon's Garb, it's just, you've got to have the timing of a god, and if you do, you're going to hit great matchups, you're going to go straight into the top 32, and you're going to face more and more of these EX decks. But as soon as you hit a day where you hit 2 or 3 GX decks, and then maybe one mad matchup or whatever, it's just going to ruin your day, and that's not because of anything other than the fact that this deck beats EXs and doesn't beat GXs. So overall impact from Sumo or Sun and Moon, Garbodor seems to be a key player, and the first kind of 2 points come together. Garbodor and Volcanion, in fact, kind of Garbodor wraps this whole thing together, but it seems to be one of the biggest techs in the format. It has been ever since it's been released, and it continues to do so. Volcanion becomes better positioned in the meta. Obviously, 2 or 3 matchups that we've mentioned get better. Doesn't gain any disgustingly bad matchups. Obviously, AQUABOX can be a problem, but I think me and Joe played the AQUABOX matchup, and I did beat it once. So that was an interesting game. So yeah, it can deal with AQUABOX simply because it's consistent. It sets up Volcanion and hits hard. VILEPLUME variants gain more traction. Obviously, LURANTIS Plume is looking to be a top contender, and the VILEPLUME box, sort of gains a new front runner in Tauros, meaning that there's less of this having to find this perfect Pokemon for the matchup as early as possible. For now, you can just spend your times setting up your board and letting your Tauros get hit and just trading for more and more damage. And Decidueye and SOLGALEO, we haven't ironed out the perfect 60 cards yet, but have so much potential. We mentioned it with SOLGALEO, how much I enjoy it, but Decidueye is just the same. It's one of the best cards in the set without a shadow of a doubt, and someone with the right 60, I think, of either of these lists could take a tournament by storm.
Yeah, those are definitely the key points to take away from it. And with all of that, if you're still sticking around, you can check out the first sort of few tournaments where we're going to be seeing these decks in action. For those of you preparing for Anaheim Regionals in the 18th and 19th of February, that is literally the first weekend that these cards are legal, so hopefully you're trading and buying and doing whatever you can to get your list perfect, and I'm sure you're testing away now. I hope this video has been helpful for you guys, and for us over in the UK, it's a little bit more easy. We get to see you guys do the blind test while we sit back, watch, pretty much glued, our eyes will be glued to the screen. I believe it's streamed, so that is going to be great news if it is. So we have at least something to go off of, because you guys are going in pretty much blind, and hopefully our discussions today has been helpful towards your own playtesting and picking up your own archetypes and what's good and whatnot. It's going to be interesting to see for certain, but at the same time, the UK or the European metagame isn't always reflective of the American meta. So even though we see the results of yours, that doesn't mean that the picture is going to be similar in any case for Sheffield, which is going to be on the 4th and 5th of March, which is going to be awesome. So yeah.
Definitely. One final point to make is, if you're still stuck, every week me, Joe, and usually Luke are streaming over on twitch.tv/Team Omnipoke. We now have access to these Sun and Moon cards. We've got a few days to sort of gather our collections between me, Joe, and Luke to be able to make some decks ready for next Wednesday. So yeah, if you want some more testing, some more just games to watch and see how matchups sort of play out, me and Joe have got a pretty interesting idea for this next week, so make sure you tune in. We're going to have lots of Sun and Moon decks and just some general discussion. It's also the best place to ask us questions other than the comment section as well. So if you guys can make it over, we do appreciate it, and it's going to be hopefully beneficial to your testing anyway.
Absolutely. So please leave a like to this video if you did, guys. It took a while not only to talk about it, but also to get it all prepared for you guys. So we really hope you did appreciate. Leave your comments down below. There's so many points that you can pick up on and discuss and question us. We always love discussing it with you. Why we think this, that, or the other. What do we think of this, that, and the other. Whatever it is, even if it's just to say hey, we appreciate every single comment from you guys. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. But for now, from me and Jack, finally we can rest our voices. This video is over, and we'll be seeing you in another one very soon.